We can't wait to hear how they do. We love you, and remember, if you can't be kind, then be quiet.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that's good to hear. Yep. All right. Thanks, Coach. Bye. What's up, Bone?
The topic for it is off-campus online student speech, and it's using that Pennsylvania case. It's going to the Supreme Court this session as a basis for a new test. So, but you can't do it. That's fine. But I thought
send it to me. I will try.
Okay.
Yeah, obviously with the new baby and everything else.
Yeah, that's if you can do it, great. If you can't,
I will try for you. I will do that. Okay.
It'll be a while before it's done, but
okay.
Start lining up proofreaders.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. All right, let's. Whew. A lot going on. Okay. All right. This is the last. This is the last chapter before your test. You know you have a test on Wednesday, yes? Everybody's in agreement on that? Wonderful. No offense. Don't really care if you're not in agreement on it. You still have a test on Wednesday. So don't know why I asked it that way. All right. So we are looking at basically more of the Gilded Age, right? So this is a continuation of a lot of what we've been discussing. By the way, maybe I should have said this first. You know what gilded is in reference to? You know what that like means?
I don't know what the actual word gilded means, but I think I know
What's the you want to take a shot at the reference there, Nico?
Not really, no.
So gilded, the idea behind this is sort of, you ever heard of, there's so many idioms that I feel like just have fallen out of use that kids don't know anymore. All that glitters isn't golden. You ever heard that? Some yeses, some nos. That's what we're talking about with the Gilded Age. Have you ever, I don't know, well, guys wear as much jewelry as girls do anymore. You ever found like cheap gold-plated earrings that you like scratch one time and then you're like, man, I thought these was gold. And then you realize that like basically they just brushed real finely with a little bit of gold, like inked it on there. That's sort of the reference to the Gilded Age, right? It looks shiny, it looks glittery, it looks like it's wonderful because there is massive wealth that's created at this time. But it really, there's so many problems created by the Gilded Age that need to be addressed, right? So it's not all that it seems. And I think we have a tendency, and I think the Gilded Age is actually a really good representation of this. A lot of the times I think we think in history classes that we only really look at or only really discuss, sort of high class society. And like, we study rich white men in American history. We don't necessarily look at other things. The Gilded Age is actually one of the examples in which we don't just look at that, because we look at things like growth in the United States and specifically urban growth as a result of industrialization in the Gilded Age. Cities went from 6 million to like 44 million in half a century, right? That's more than 700% population growth. Y'all realize just how much that is. Okay. And people were packing to these urban areas in order to find in order to find jobs. And there were some technological advancements that made things more advantageous, right? Like the elevator, for instance. Okay. Because like we don't live in a major metropolitan area, right? Like we don't live in New York City. Okay. But if you lived in New York City and you were on like the 20th floor of an apartment building, would you like to take the stairs every day? No. Right? In fact, like in New York City, you really couldn't build buildings taller than like 5 stories until the invention of the elevator. Right? So it's not just like the Bessemer steam process that we already talked about that, yes, does allow for like skyscrapers, and it does allow for greater stability in making buildings taller and larger and greater. But even once that steel framing and structure makes a 10-story or a 20-story or a 50-story building stable and capable of being built, nobody's going to the 50th floor on the stairs. They're just not happening, right? So as the cities grow, as these new technologies aid in growth, growth brings with it its own problems, things like disease and dirt, or the dirty conditions. There's a lack of infrastructure. You know what that word means? Infrastructure. It can, but not in this instance. Infrastructure actually refers to like things, like it's a noun, right? In this instance, when we say infrastructure, what we're actually talking about is the roads, the water pipes, the water towers, electricity. Like that is all infrastructure that is created by government, right? Like we don't pipe things ourselves, right? Like when I built my house a few years ago, I'm gonna say when somebody built my house a few years ago, like they didn't have to lay pipe from underneath my house so that I had running water all the way to like the water tower in town, right? Or worse yet, like all the way to some sort of river and have like a water pump at the river that like it just doesn't work that way. We have governmental resources that handle things like that. But when you have this massive influx of population to the urban areas, that infrastructure is initially lacking, right? Think about it in terms that you would understand. For the last, 15 years, it seems like they've been expanding Highway 59, yes? Like all your lives. That's what it seems like, doesn't it? Okay? The reason is because that road would become inadequate for the number of people that lived in this area and were trying to get into Houston. So they needed to expand it in order to meet the needs of the population, right? When you have that massive influx of population to urban areas, and this is a growing area, but it's growing by like 4 or 5%, right? Not like hundreds of percents. Okay. So there was no way initially to keep up with sort of the demands. And so ultimately you're leaving all these people that left the rural areas. They're leaving rural areas because there's no economic opportunity there, right? Like land has all been bought up. There's no more frontier. Remember, we already talked about that, right? No more frontier, which means there's no more like free land and easy opportunity to make wealth that way. There's no jobs, right? So now they're going to the city. And so they're trading those problems for city problems of poor sanitation, overcrowding. When you have poor sanitation and overcrowding, inevitably you have disease. Okay. And so one of the things that we have to do very early on is we have to create some sort of sanitation in terms of creating ways of getting clean running water. Like, y'all realize, I mean, we actually live fairly close enough to the country. Y'all might sort of understand this. You realize horses just like walk and poop at the same time, right? Y'all know that? They're not like dogs, right? Like a dog will go like wander around and find somewhere and be like, this is where I'm pooping, right? Horses are actually really stupid animals. Right? Like, they're beautiful and they're wonderful. And if you love horses, I'm not trying to say anything, but like a horse will literally run itself to death. Like, if you just keep whipping a horse and telling the horse to run, it will run literally until it dies. Like, it's not smart enough to stop and not kill itself. Right? So literally horses will just walk and poop, walk and poop, walk and poop. So when we have like horse-drawn buggies on the streets in New York City, what are we doing with all that poop? You realize that's like a sanitation problem, yes? You realize poop carries diseases, yes? Wonderful, okay. The next two maps here are pretty good indicators to you of sort of what things look like. So this is 1880, which is basically the very beginning of industrialization, and then this is 1920. And so by 1920, what you see, one is a significant number of cities now that have a population of 100,000 or more, right? And some of these are cities that you wouldn't even necessarily think of as having that large of a population when we think about like large population cities today, like Rochester, New York, or Birmingham, Alabama. Like, they're not massive major cities in America today, but they are in the by 1920 because of industrialization and because, you know, Birmingham, for instance, is like the steel capital of the South, right? And we obviously are producing a significant amount of steel because we need it for railroad lines and for all sorts of other things. We also see a new wave of immigration. And so when you look at immigration throughout U.S. history, there's been various waves of immigration. So immigration sort of ebbs and flows, and some of it is draw. It's pull from the United States because the U.S. has things that immigrants want. Sometimes it's actually a push out of Europe due to things like the Irish potato famine, which is mid-19th century. I forget exactly when it is. You know, because the Irish were all like starving to death. I mean, literally, you might as well get on a boat and go to America, right? Like, but what we have is the industrialization, the turn into the 20th century shifts immigration in the United States, right? So a lot of our immigration prior to this period of time was very like Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, Germanic areas, right? Like England, Germany, Ireland, maybe some Scandinavian. Now we're going to see a significant influx in Southern and Eastern Europeans, right? So now we're going to see a significant increase in Greeks, Italians, and even like Russian Jews. Okay. When immigrants came to the United States, or European immigrants, they entered into the U.S. through Ellis Island, which is literally, it's an island in New York City that's like a stone's throw from, I think it's called Liberty Island. I think it's actually called Liberty Island, where the Statue of Liberty is. But another thing that as they come into Ellis Island, one, they're screened there. don't think that immigration is like a new problem in the United States, or that nativism or like anti-immigration sentiment is a new problem in the United States. It's not. There was fallback and issues over all of this, 100 years ago as well. But they're screened in Ellis Island to ensure that they're not like, mentally handicapped or physically handicapped to where they would be a drain on the American resources and not like aid in the development of America. And then once they get through Ellis Island, generally what would happen, and this is actually a term, because I realize, hopefully you realize, right, we're talking about obviously post-Civil War era, right? So like slavery is done, but we do still have segregation in the United States. And some of it in the South, for instance, is segregation by law. But even in the North, where you didn't have the same sort of segregated law, like legal segregation, you still had immigrant communities. And so as the immigrants flood in, because again, there's no more land, right? So they can't find land in the United States anymore. So they got to go find a job. They help flood the cities too. That's part of that massive increase in urbanization at the time, right? But they're then going to settle into communities within these urban areas that are most familiar to them, right? And so this is how we actually get ethnic neighborhoods in major cities in America, right? Like if you go to San Francisco today, for instance, right? Like San Francisco has a very, very popular Chinatown district, right? New York has Little Italy, right? Which is obviously the Italian neighborhood. They have Hell's Kitchen, right? Which is the Irish neighborhood. They have, their own Chinatown. Like most of these major metropolitan areas have immigrant communities. Some of these immigrant communities, I'm not saying that they don't try to assimilate. Like a lot of them do try to assimilate at least somewhat. But they also don't necessarily speak the language, and they have their own like traditions in terms of cuisine and what they eat and what's familiar to them, right? And so these are things that happen. So you'll find like markets that stock items that are not necessarily common elsewhere, right? Just because of the differences in the cultures. Okay. Now, obviously, we talked about this a second, or I mentioned this a second ago. With this massive influx in immigration, there is some backlash, some what we call nativism. Nativism is just anti-immigration sentiment, right? Where we don't like the immigrants and we want to, preserve the American way of life. They put restrictions on immigration. They put restrictions on where immigrants can live. They put restrictions on the various types of jobs that immigrants can have. And so a lot of this is done really out of like economic fear. I don't know why. There's a long-standing sentiment in the United States that immigrants come here and take our jobs. There was probably some truth to that in the 1900s. It's not really accurate anymore, right? Like immigrants, like no immigrant is coming here and taking your job as a doctor. Like that's just not happening, right? Instead, immigrants come here and they take a job picking strawberries in a field for like $20 a bushel, and it takes all day to make a bushel. Like you're not doing that job anyway, all right? With urbanization, with the advent of shift work and industrialization, we get some increases in, or some change. I want to say changes. Maybe the development of culture and leisure and like fun and things like that. Like that didn't really happen on the frontier. On the frontier, you don't have fun. right? Like literally everything is life and death. It's work. Like you can't just be like, hey, I'm going to knock back a few beers and relax. Because if you do that in the wilderness on your own property, like all of a sudden the natives come and they kill you, right? Or a bear comes and it kills you, right? Or you get drunk and you're stumbling through the woods and you fall down a ravine and then you got like literally the what was it? The dude that makes not South Park, Family Guy, Seth MacFarlane, right? Like made a movie, was it 1001 Ways to Die in the West, right? Like kind of mocking that concept. Like literally everything would kill you, right? Out on the frontier. Once we have, cities and shift work and things like that, now all of a sudden we're going to have like downtime, we have leisure time. Like you don't have to go and reinforce the well, right? Or cut down more trees for like heating or whatever. And so vaudeville is one, right? They're like variety shows, comedy, singing, dancing, whatever. That are they become pretty popular. Again, entertainment, like the entertainment industry sort of becomes a thing. Okay. This is sort of the rise of baseball in America, right? Because baseball is also a leisure activity, where you can go and watch a game for, a penny or whatever you're paying to get into the bleachers, right? Women do have some options, but again, they have far fewer options than what the men do, right? So, obviously you could become a seamstress, you could work in some sort of textile factory, but for the most part, women are expected to remain in the home. They're expected to marry. They're expected to raise children and do the cooking and the cleaning and then this and then that and whatever. Single women do generally have a little bit more free time and leisure and opportunity than married women because there's no bigger drain on life than kids. Like I love my children. Like don't think that kids are bad. But that's just a fact. Like once you have children, you don't really have time for much else. So, spectator sports, we just talked about that a second ago in terms of baseball. So you have spectator sports becoming another form of leisure, whether that's horse racing. College football becomes a thing at this time. I'm trying to think what else. College football, baseball, basketball's invented by now. Like it's fairly significant, right? It's hard to talk about the Gilded Age and not talk about Darwin. If you don't know who Charles Darwin is a scientific theorist, I guess would be the best way of explaining it. Basically comes up with this idea of evolution and how species survive, right? And so Darwin is looking at it from like a macro level and looking at like species, birds, things like that. But there's a whole subset of people in the late 19th century that sort of take Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest and they apply it to society, right? And so sometimes you'll hear this term social Darwinism, right? Social Darwinism is this idea that like we as people are going to practice Darwinism. And so if you suck and you can't make it, you're going to die and we don't care, right? Like that's a you problem. That's your fault. Darwin was probably not a big supporter of this, but it is through his sort of writings that this happens. And Spencer is the guy who comes up, or who really is sort of championing this idea of social Darwinism. But it's really an idea that it's not up to society as a whole, or it's not up to government. It's not part of their responsibilities to fix problems that are viewed as the result of human inadequacy, right? Like let's put it this way. We'll just be really crass here and mean, right? Like, let's just say, for the sake of argument, you're born with a genetic abnormality and you have no arms. You know that happens sometimes, right? You're just born without arms. They didn't develop. It happens. Sucks, right? You don't have arms. According to social Darwinism, what's going to happen to you? You're going to die because nobody's going to feed you. You ain't got no arms. You can't feed yourself. And in reality, like, you realize that there are people that have no arms that do feed themselves because they figured out how to do it with their feet. Yes. Right. But social Darwinism basically says, like, we're not even going to take care of you long enough for you to figure out how to feed yourself with your feet. Like, you just going to die. Like, right. And if you don't die, like, if you actually figured out how to feed yourself with your feet fast enough that you don't die, good for you. That's survival of the fittest. You turned out to be fit. Congratulations. You're one of us. Right? That's sort of the idea. As crass as that sounds, that's the idea. But there's obviously a significant amount of pushback to that, because Darwin is applying his theories really to animals, right? To, like, birds, to monkeys, to animals that don't necessarily know how to rationalize, don't necessarily know how to overcome their most basic instincts, right? Like, you realize, like, animals' most basic instincts, there's really like 3 of them, right? Eat, survive, right? Fight, and procreate, right? Like, mate, create spawn, because that's it. Those are your 3 most basic instincts. Yet we overcome that, right? Because we don't just run around trying to procreate whenever we want. We realize that there's a time and place for that, right? We don't just go running around like go watch rams on, like, a mountainside somewhere where they're just like, I'm going to be the alpha, and then they just headbutt each other until one of them yields. Like, we don't do that, right? Like, we have learned to overcome those basic urges because we have humanity. And so, like, Ward and this reformed Darwinism is really trying to counteract that. I don't think social Darwinism as a whole is really very successful, right? Like, it's not something that has widespread support. But it's probably still worth mentioning in a history class, because there are still people that sort of believe in social Darwinism today, right? That have that sort of mentality that it's not society's responsibility to care for the infirmed or whomever. Excuse me. Art at the time, realism replaces romanticism, which, when you look at art and artistic movements within U.S. history, there are various periods of artistic, like, what's popular. You know what I mean? Like, obviously art, like, you can literally create whatever art you want whenever you want. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be like the prominent type of the prominent type of art at the time. But the Gilded Age sees a change in like Romanticism and then Transcendentalism, right? And instead, we're going to become much more realistic. Realism and trying to capture real life and show real life through art and literature becomes a lot more relevant, right? So this painting is actually, a painting of a boxing match, which is trying to capture sort of the almost violent nature of boxing, right? Like just how gritty it is, just how aggressive it is. And so when you look at the art, when you look at this painting here, and you can see, like, for instance, you can see the guys, like the definition of their muscles, right? Like far more realistic than some sort of like abstract or Romanticism, which tends to be more of like this idealistic idea of what things should be, right? So there's a significant shift in art at this time, and I think there's a significant shift in it because, again, like the Gilded Age implies, there's a whole undercurrent of all of this that we know is nasty and bad and not beneficial to the welfare of sort of the nation and general people. Gilded Age politics. This is actually where Gilded Age comes from. So Mark Twain, the author Mark Twain, he's the first I know of to use the term Gilded Age, right? And when he uses it, he's actually referring specifically to politics, because politics at this time looks like everything is, wonderful and great, and people have political opportunity and they're voting and we have democracy and yada, yada, yada. But in reality, the politics of the Gilded Age is incredibly corrupt. You had political machines that were manipulating all sorts of things behind the scenes. And so, like, Boss Tweed is always the example that's used. Tweed is a New York City politician that basically runs New York City, right? So his political machine basically controls voting. It controls who votes. And Boss Tweed will give just enough to the immigrants to make them think that he's on their side, when in reality they're doing things that are really just lining their own pockets, right? Like, government becomes so corrupt at this point that everything that's awarded, everything that's like a government contract goes to like Boss Tweed's cronies. And in fact, the way that it really works, or the way that it's supposed to work at least, is you have, and we'll use where I went to college here as an example. So the University of North Carolina, they repaint their football stadium every year, right? Every year they repaint the entire football stadium. And so at the end of the season, when they want to go repaint the stadium, they have it contracted out. And so they basically tell anybody with a painting company, or even like Nico, if he wanted to, he could submit a bid, right? And then everybody writes down, like, here's how much I'm going to charge you, and here's, like, this is what it's going to take, right? And then they all put those in envelopes and they seal them up. And then on a deadline, the university stops taking the envelopes. They open them all up, they find the lowest number, and congratulations, you got the contract. That's how much we're going to pay you, and go repaint the stadium now. The way that it worked in Boss Tweed's day and age, right, is all of these envelopes would be submitted, right, but we would already know who we were going to pick, right? So if I'm Boss Tweed and Nico is my boy, right, we're friendly, and Haley submits a bid to repaint the stadium for $100,000 because that's what she can do it for, and Nico submits a bid to repaint the stadium for $200,000, right? I take Nico's, because how much does it actually cost to repaint the stadium? $100,000, because we know she can do it for $100,000, right? But instead, I picked Nico's bid of $200,000, right? So now I, as the government, pay Nico $200,000, and what does he do? He spends $100,000 of it to repaint stadiums. That's what it costs. What's he do with the other $100,000? Oh, hell no! You better not be keeping that. Because who gave you that money? Yeah. So where's my cut?
Why do you get a cut if I'm doing something for you?
No, son. I did something for you. I just gave you a contract so you could make some money repainting a stadium when I should have given it to Haley. Not only that, I gave you extra money. So you better give me some back. I want my kickback. Because guess what? If you don't give me my kickback, guess what happens to you? Because I run the government, I'm going to find a reason to put your butt in jail. Right? That's sort of the idea. Now, there's corruption on a national level as well, right? The whole sort of idea of patronage and giving people jobs is problematic, but also the massive corporations. And I've always liked this political cartoon that's on the board there, or on the screen there. These massive corporations acquire so much wealth so quickly that they're able to sort of wield that wealth and use it to garner all sorts of favors from government, right? So the idea here is it's called the spoils system, which is basically what I was just trying to explain there with Nico. And so we ultimately get to try to get rid of the spoils system and actually really reform the system. And not only are we really going to reform the spoils system, but we also try to reform patronage and how people get jobs within government. Because literally we had a president, because the way this used to work is you help the president get elected, right? And then in return, that president would hook you up with a job, right? So like all the people that helped get James A. Garfield elected, right? They went to the White House and they're like, all right, dude, what job you got for me? And Garfield was like, hey, you get to be the postmaster of Boston. Hey, you get to be the superintendent of the Washington, D.C. school district. Hey, you get to be secretary of the interior. Whoa, hold up, bro. You made me a postmaster. How come they get to be the secretary of the interior? Like, that's a way better job. Don't disrespect me like that. You know what happens when you disrespect Southerners like that? In the 19th century, they shoot you. No, I'm serious. Like, that's Southern culture. Like, no, I mean, y'all kind of laugh, but you realize that like gang culture now in America, it actually has its roots in like old school antebellum Southern culture. Because I'm sure, and when I say gang culture, I mean, obviously, I do mean gangs, but not just gangs. Think about it. Have you ever had a friend? That was like, they got in a fight with somebody, and you're like, why'd you fight them? Because they disrespected me, man. That's a stupid reason to fight somebody. You know how often students disrespect me? Zach sleeping through my class right now. That's kind of disrespectful, isn't it? Right? Nico over there playing on his phone. He ain't paying attention. That's kind of disrespectful. Should I just fight all of you? Right. I mean, one, the cultural aspect of this is sort of asinine and stupid. Okay. But not only that, because of this cultural aspect, and now you have people going to the president. Not everybody can get a great job. Not everybody can be Secretary of State. So somebody felt disrespected. So they pulled out a gun and they shot Garfield. Shot him, killed him, murdered the president. All because they didn't get the right job, right? Which leads to some significant reform in civil service. We end the spoil system. We end patronage. We actually have something, and I believe it's 1888, something like that. That's the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, right? Which is going to get rid of this. Okay. A lot of the other the aspects of politics in the late 19th century is there's a lot of back and forth over this. Thanks.
With a lot of caramel and macchiato.
Yes, they did. That's okay. I can get something sweet. I ain't complaining. Thank you very much. Presidents don't last terribly long after like Ulysses S. Grant. So like Grant does his 2 terms, and Grant was a military dude who tried to not have like he tried to be like legit and not have a whole bunch of like corruption. But Grant was also an alcoholic and struggled immensely with that, so he didn't have a whole lot of control. Hayes, the next president, got his presidency through some like shady backroom dealing. He lasted 1 term. Garfield takes over. He lasts a couple of months and then he's shot and killed. Right. Chester A. Arthur takes over after that. Okay. And then from Arthur, we get to Cleveland. Okay. Who, you know, is basically trying to fix the system, right? But that doesn't really help. Cleveland does try to implement some significant changes, and he does try to utilize the government, the power of the government, in order to support the people. So he's probably one of the early examples of sort of the what we'll get into with the progressive era, where government is now trying to fix some of these issues the Gilded Age and the industrialization is creating, right? So some of the things that he does, right, is the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is supposed to oversee railroads and how railroads interact, you know, whether or not railroads are engaged in like price fixing or other detrimental economic behaviors, right? Like things that are adversely affecting a subset of the population that are just not fair, that are not equitable, right? Like that's some of the stuff that Cleveland is concerned about. Cleveland does lose out in '88 to Benjamin Harrison, who is actually son or grandson of William Henry Harrison, who is the shortest tenured president in the history of the United States. But Harrison wins one term, and then we actually go back to Cleveland, and Cleveland is able to regain the White House. And at that point, we really begin to get into some of the real progressive aspects of the gilded of industrialization and political response to industrialization, right? The Antitrust Act is one example. You know what a trust is? It's another word for a monopoly, right? Monopolies are actually bad, so not a positive thing. The Silver Purchase Act is literally the government buying up a whole bunch of silver in order to make coins. Because at various times in U.S. history, the government our money has actually been backed by gold and silver, and other times it hasn't. It's not backed by anything right now. The McKinley tariff is trying to raise money or raise taxes on imports in order to try to help American manufacturing. Again, because we're not the only ones going through industrialization at this time. With the massive expansion of sort of economics and economic opportunity and the massive creation of wealth, there are some issues as to what we should do about currency in the United States. And this actually brings up a really interesting sort of conversation that we're not going to have time for today, unfortunately, about your money and what money actually is and like what money exists for, right? If you have $1 on you, do you know what it says at the top? Any idea? This is Federal Reserve note. Anybody know what a note is? A note is an IOU. That's all it is. It's a promise that I'm going to give you something of value later. That's what our money is. Our money has no value. It's just a promise that later on, the government will give you something of value for that money, for that piece of paper. Okay. So that's the way our money is right now. I will be honest with you well, most of you will probably have me from next year for government, so I probably shouldn't tell you this because I don't like telling people my political ideologies and beliefs, but I'm going to tell you all anyway. Yeah, the Federal Reserve notes are a joke. Because our money should be backed by something tangible, right? Meaning gold and or silver. It's not at all. In which case, it has no actual value. And therefore, at some point, the value will actually go down to zero. I mean, it'll cause problems. We had some significant economic problems at this time. One, as we create this money, the monetary supply, before it's backed by anything, it has no real value. We're creating essentially what is referred to, or what could be referred to as soft money. And so then ultimately, you're manipulating the system. Farmers, don't get any of that. They don't partake in the massive wealth creation of the industrial age in the United States. And as a result, the massive decrease in crop prices and the economic instability of farming and agriculture in general, there's a significant amount of unrest within that community, and agriculture begins to actually become political. They create an organization called the Granger Movement, right? They have the Farmers Alliance. They're going to become politically active. They're going to advocate for some different things. Your next short response is actually William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech, right, in which he is actually advocating that the U.S. back currency on the dollar, like back currency with gold, okay? But this becomes very much a populist movement. And so we see sort of a flare-up political party, the Populist Party at this point, that can help manipulate the outcome of elections, right? Third parties don't win elections, but they can swing elections one way or the other. In 1893, we enter into a depression. And really what happens is now that we are industrialized and we have a market economy, we have ebbs and flows. Depressions are actually pretty normal, but people don't realize this yet. Which, again, this is the last slide, and I'm not terribly upset that we didn't get to it, because this is Brian's Cross of Gold, and this is what you'll read on Monday. All right. But yeah, have a good day.
I have a question.
What's up?
Is this going to be on our D2L?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.